Welcome to Despicable Maine Deep Dives. Today on the show, imagine this for a second. A major conflict kicks off, but not because of some clear, unprovoked attack. What if the spark, the very event that starts the war, was actually faked, designed to look like something else entirely? It's a pretty jarring thought, isn't it? We're talking about false flag operations. These are incidents basically crafted to deceive everyone, to make it seem like an attack came from one group, when in reality it was planned and carried out by someone else. And, this isn't just stuff from movies. It's a real element in serious geopolitical talk. Our sources even point to times the U.S. itself has allegedly used this playbook to get into wars. So today, we're going to dive deep into some current worries about potential false flags, especially around the tensions brewing in the Middle East. And then we'll peel back the history pages, look at some alleged false flag events that really have shaped global conflicts, focusing a bit on those claims about U.S. actions.
Exactly. Our goal here is to sift through what our sources are saying. That includes expert analysis, historical accounts, you name it. We'll look at the allegations, the history, but also, importantly, the counter-arguments you hear from mainstream folks. We want to pull out the key details so you get a really full picture of this, very controversial topic.
Okay, all right. Let's unpack this. So the immediate thing getting a lot of attention right now, sparking some really intense online debate, is this idea that maybe, just maybe, a false flag attack could be staged, specifically to pull the U.S. into a war with Iran.
That's the core of it, yeah. These claims suggest that certain groups, maybe with their own agendas, could set something up. Could be an attack on U.S. property, maybe even a staged terrorist thing, and then point the finger straight at Iran.
Right. Create that undeniable reason to go in.
Precisely. Manufacture the pretext, basically, to escalate things into a real conflict.
And the thing that seems to be really fueling this specific speculation is the deployment of the USS Nimitz. That's the Navy's oldest nuclear carrier, the CVN, right? Sent to the Persian Gulf. And, well, conspiracy theorists are having a field day, saying it could be the centerpiece of a false flag.
And what really zeroes in on the Nimitz theory is this, pretty grim detail. The carrier is actually scheduled to be decommissioned in about a year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and that fact has led to some really stark speculation. One source puts it bluntly, saying, and I'm quoting here, if you are a neocon warmonger, meaning someone pushing for aggressive foreign policy, and you really want to set off WW3, this would be a great way to do it. Send an old CVN about to be scrapped anyway, and 5,000 Navy sailors to the bottom of the sea.
That's chilling. The idea that it's seen as potentially expendable to trigger something bigger, and the sources suggest this isn't without precedent for the U.S.
Exactly. That's the really disturbing undercurrent in these theories, that it fits a pattern some sees in past U.S. actions.
And you connect that Nimitz theory to the whole situation in the Strait of Hormuz. Suddenly it makes a bit more, uncomfortable sense why people are talking about it. We're talking about, 20% of global oil going through there every day?
A huge amount. And Iran has repeatedly threatened to block the strait, especially when facing U.S. sanctions. If they did that, oil prices would likely go through the roof, economies could wobble, and it would almost certainly force the U.S. to step in directly.
So some sources are saying that's the major reason a false flag is imminent. It's a quick way to get that intervention trigger pull.
That's the argument being made, yes. And you have to factor in Iran's way of fighting, their asymmetric capabilities. They got things like truck-mounted anti-ship missiles they can hide almost anywhere. A big ground invasion seems impractical, maybe invites huge losses.
We've seen how effective those missiles can be, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. You think back to 1987, the USS Stark, hit by an Iraqi Exocet missile that's one of those sea-skimming ones. Killed 37 crew. It was supposedly an accident, but it shows the vulnerability. Or the Falklands War. The British Navy lost 6 ships, HMS Sheffield included, to Exocets.
So these aren't idle threats. A confrontation there could get very messy, very fast, which I suppose ties into this whole idea of needing a justification.
It highlights the danger, yes. And it leads us right back to that historical context you mentioned. These modern fears, they really do draw on past incidents, suggesting maybe there's a pattern or at least a strong precedent, especially involving the U.S.
Okay, so let's define terms a bit. A false flag is when you do something but make it look like someone else did it.
Right, disguising the real source of responsibility. But there's another concept some sources mention, sometimes called a green flag operation. This is the idea where maybe leaders know an attack is coming from an enemy.
And they just let it happen.
They let it play out, yeah. The theory is they do it to generate public outrage, build support for going to war, It's a pretty cynical thought, but it's part of the conversation around these kinds of events.
Okay, so let's dive into some of these historical examples people point to, especially ones involving the U.S. The USS Liberty incident in '67 seems to come up a lot.
It does. During the Six-Day War, this U.S. intelligence ship was attacked by Israeli forces. Israel said it was a terrible mistake, mistaken identity.
But there are other theories.
Yeah, alternative theories, sometimes referencing declassified documents, suggest it might have been intended as a false flag. The idea was maybe to blame Egypt, perhaps with U.S. knowledge or even collusion, to distract from the wider Arab-Israeli conflict.
And the ship survived, but...
But 34 Americans were killed, 171 wounded. It was a major incident. And according to some accounts, President Lyndon Johnson basically swept it under the rug, which, leaves those questions about intent just hanging there.
Wow, okay. And then, maybe even more famous or infamous, is the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. That's the one that really opened the door for the Vietnam War, right?
Absolutely. It was the justification. The official story was U.S. destroyers were attacked without provocation off North Vietnam. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving broad authority for military action.
But that story wasn't quite right.
Not entirely, no. Later evidence, crucial evidence, showed the U.S. had actually been running CIA-led sabotage missions, essentially provoking the North Vietnamese. The destroyers were, as some sources put it, used like pawns to draw fire.
So not an unprovoked attack at all. It shows how things can be twisted or maybe deliberately misinterpreted to build a case for war.
Precisely. It highlights how tricky it is to sort out the truth when tensions are high and information is weaponized.
That's manipulation of an actual event.
Yeah.
What about cases where things were just made up or planned?
Well, that brings us to Operation Northwoods. This is just staggering. It was a real proposal from the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff back in 1962.
A real proposal to do what?
To stage fake terrorist attacks on American soil, or at least create the convincing appearance of attacks. Things like blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay, staging riots, maybe even shooting down a civilian airliner. And the plan was to blame it all on Cuba to justify invading.
They actually wrote this down.
They did. Now, President Kennedy rejected it, thankfully, but the fact that it was seriously proposed by top military leaders, it gives you a chilling insight into the kind of thinking that can happen when creating a pretext for war is the goal.
Unbelievable. Okay, jumping forward a bit. More recent history, like Iraq in 2003.
Yeah, our sources are pretty direct on that. The claims about weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and Saddam Hussein's links to al-Qaeda, they were later proven false. That was the whole basis for the invasion.
And even earlier, the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm in '91.
Sources point to the story about Iraqi soldiers taking babies out of incubators in Kuwait. Remember that? It was incredibly powerful testimony.
Yeah, it caught outrage.
Exactly. But sources say it was grossly exaggerated, maybe even fabricated, specifically to inflame public opinion and build support for the war. A potent emotional trigger based on, well, questionable information. These examples show how intelligence, or alleged intelligence, can be shaped or even invented to sell a war.
So bringing this all together, this history of alleged deception, these past incidents involving the U.S., what does it all mean for today, for this USS Nimitz speculation?
It means you have a really strong debate playing out, and that history is right at the center of it. On one side, you have people looking at these past events, Liberty, Tonkin, Northwoods, Iraq, and saying, look, there's a pattern here. They argue, as some sources put it, that it's just common sense to consider a Nimitz false flag possible, given this history.
They see a track record, essentially.
A concerning track record, yes. But then on the other side, you have mainstream analysts pushing back hard, expressing a lot of skepticism.
Like who? What are they saying?
Well, you have figures like Rear Admiral James Stavridis, who used to be NATO's supreme allied commander. He basically says the idea of sacrificing the Nimitz for leverage is nonsense from a practical standpoint. His quote is, "Destroying it would be a victory worth more to the enemy than even the Wolfowitz Doctrine could justify."
Meaning the strategic loss for the U.S. would be far too great.
Exactly. He's arguing the carrier is too valuable, its loss would be catastrophic, not some calculated gain.
What about the information angle, the spread of these ideas?
Right. Experts on digital misinformation, like Anjali Janchandani from NYU, point out that this kind of false flag talk thrives on fear and isolation. She notes there's often zero credible evidence behind these specific theories, but they spread fast online because, as she puts it, social platforms reward outrage, not rigor.
So the echo chamber effect.
Pretty much. And it's important to note that some of the historical evidence cited, like Project Cyanide linked to the USS Liberty, often comes from declassified leaks, but maybe without many other confirming primary sources, it can be hard to verify definitively. Plus, Iran itself has openly talked about blocking Hormuz as a defensive move against sanctions, giving their own rationale that doesn't involve a false flag.
So it's a complex picture with arguments on both sides.
Absolutely. And the whole debate really throws the high geopolitical stakes into sharp relief. It also highlights how dangerous these what-if scenarios can become when they spread like wildfire online without solid proof. That line between a real threat and a manufactured one gets incredibly blurry.
Okay, so let's recap this deep dive. We've looked at this intense speculation happening right now about a potential false flag involving the USS Nimitz and Iran. We examined the claims, why the Nimitz is central to them.
Especially the decommissioning angle.
Right. And then we dove into that unsettling history of alleged false flags and deceptions, particularly instances where the U.S. was involved or implicated, from the Liberty to Tonkin to Iraq. And we also heard the counter-arguments, the skepticism from military analysts and misinformation experts.
Yeah, it really underscores just how complex and frankly murky these geopolitical games can be. That line between what's a genuine threat and what might be a staged event, it can seem incredibly thin sometimes. It makes thinking critically just absolutely essential in today's world, flooded as we are with information and disinformation.
So considering all this, the history we've discussed, the claims, the counterclaims, the very real dangers of misinformation, it leaves you with a pretty heavy question, doesn't it? How do you, listening right now, how do you sort through it all? How do you tell the difference between a genuine threat and a manufactured reason for conflict? And maybe even bigger, what's our collective responsibility in questioning these narratives, especially when they're pushing us towards war? Something definitely worth thinking about. Thanks for tuning in to the Despicable Maine Deep Dive podcast. Remember, the United States has been hijacked, so soon living in the United States will be theft of your life. And as always, living in Maine is theft of your life. Every day you are there is just another day stolen.